Hello. So this is the newest video, the top 100 facts about John Quincy Adams. Probably not going to get a lot of views, but I already started this series, so I am going to finish him. First fact, he was the only president that has a Q in his name. Up to present day, no other president have a Q in his name. Fun fact, he was the first president to be born in the summer, which is kind of weird. He was the first non-spring born president in over a 30-year period. So from Thomas Jefferson to Andrew Johnson, there was only him that wasn't born in the spring. There's this place called Quincy, Massachusetts. It was named after his grandfather. That's where he was born at. So yeah, there's also this place called Quincy, Florida. It was founded during his presidency, so they named it after him. Of course, 3 years later, there would be a 3 years earlier, I should say, there was a seat in Illinois named Quincy, named after him. Um, of the first eight presidents, him and Thomas Jefferson was the only two presidents to not have blue or gray eyes. So yeah, that's very interesting. He famously wore mutton chops, but during his presidency, he was clean shaven, of course. He was the first. He was the first president since George Washington not to have a foreign country invade this country. He was the first U.S. president to be known by three names. That's interesting. He was the first of the seven to well, he died at 80, so he was the longest living of the first eight presidents. Okay, so he was one of three presidents named John Adams, his father, him, of course, and JFK. So yeah, he was the only ex-president to serve in the House of Congress. Of course, he was the only president to serve in Congress. He was elected in 1838 and he served 17 years. So yeah, he died on the House floor. Literally died on the House floor, had a stroke, maybe a stroke of genius, I don't know. There was the slave rebellion where he was the lawyer that defended them. He tried to fight the gag rule when it came to not talking about slavery. He had a master's when he was 26. That's pretty cool. Um, he wrote lifelong diaries, over 14,000 pages. So that was pretty shocking. He was definitely into science. He was the first son of a former president. And of course, he would have George W. Bush follow him. He is the only president whose father signed their Declaration of Independence. That's John Adams. He was the first president to be photographed. That's pretty cool. He was the first president to be elected despite losing the popular vote. He was also like the first president to like have the election sent to the House. Of course, uh, resulting his win, it was called the corrupt bargain. He was the only president to serve in the House off two different like parties, Whig. Um, he was the first president to have a wife born outside of America, London Girls. He was the first president to have a foreign born wife. He was a diplomat. He did diplomatic affairs under five presidents. So yeah, he was the only president to suffer a heart attack and die in the U.S. Capitol building. Oh, he was fluent in seven languages. He was the minister to Russia. He was the first president to appoint a cabinet outside of his party. It was Henry Clay. He was highly unpopular by the press. He was the last president to be elected under the 12th Amendment, under the 12th Amendment. Um, he famously kept an alligator in his bathtub. He disagreed with his original party. Remember, he had multiple parties about Thomas Jefferson and then eventually got kicked out. He famously argued for the creation of the weighting scale we have today. He was the first president to have a son that later ran for president. That was pretty cool. He was the only president to own and use a personal billboard table. Um, he was the first president to have a son die of cancer, RIP. He was the only president whose wife suffered a miscarriage. Oh, RIP again. He was one of only two presidents to serve in the House or Senate, the other one being Andrew Johnson. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities between him and George W. Bush. Both of them are sons of presidents, both of them being elected without the majority of the votes. There was a lot of similarities between him and Hayes, both being supposedly elected because of a corrupt bargain. Hayes in 77. Um, he had five party switches, the most of any like president. The five party switches are, of course, the Federalists all the way down to the Whigs. Um, him and Andrew Johnson were the only two presidents who served their presidency for the Union. John Tyler served for the Confederacy, so yeah, that's pretty cool. Following the footsteps of his father, he did not attend his successor's inauguration. That's Andrew Jackson, and of course, his father didn't attend Thomas Jefferson. He was the first president to own a pocket silkworm. Ugh. He was the first president to be interviewed by a female. He was a lifelong sufferer of depression. I would too if I had that mug. Um, his first son was named George Washington, of course, after Washington himself. He was the first president to have a son married in a White House. He was the first president to win a seat in Congress by running on the anti Masonic Party. He held the record for the longest diary in history. He was the first president to travel by steamboat. He was the first former president to be elected to Arts twice. In the House, he was so well known that they called him a madman from Massachusetts. Bars. He was the first president to have a biography written about him while he was alive. The guy who later wrote his biography was the Secretary of State for Lincoln. Should have wrote Lincoln's biography. Um, at 10, he did some incredible stuff. He was the first president to regularly go to the theater. Again, reminds me of Lincoln. He was the first president to give a July 4th uh, uh, address, which was pretty cool. He was the first president to minister to five different countries. That was pretty cool. He was the first president to deny a seat in the Supreme Court. Later, is taken up by Taft. He was part of this philosophy group. He visited the state of Ohio before it was really a state. He was actually the first president to do that. Um, his son served as a U.S. minister. Um, God, his sons were so successful. He once walks. He walks 6 miles. He walks 6 miles on average. He was the first sitting president to be like displayed in a cartoon. He was the first president to own a personal copy of the Doomsday Book. Creepy. He was the first president to. Oh yeah. Um, he was the first. He was the first president whose wife had fled the Napoleon army. That's pretty cool. He was the first president to have his presidency end on a Wednesday. Ooh, Wednesday, so creepy. He was the first president to be given a formal gift of a lion. Pretty creepy. He was the only president to win via the 12th Amendment after failing to get a majority. Ooh. He was the first. He was known for running around with an ink pad. He was the first president to build a stone temple. Ugh. He was the first president to have a national university. He was the first president to document a social security. Okay. He was the first president to serve in the House of Representatives while his own son was a member of the state. And this was a rare duo, so that's kind of cool. He was the first president to refuse the lower office. He was the first president to formally protest against the Indian Removal Act. Johnson did not care. He was the first sitting president to be mentioned in a European novel. That's very novel. He was the first president to have his life work seen on a major screen. He was the first president to have a ball canceled. Um, he was the first president to deliver a 3-hour speech to the Supreme Court, which he denied working there. Of course, he was the first. He was a big help when it came to the U.S. Census. He was the first president to have a book plate. He was the first president to formally be invited and join a anti-slavery society. He was the first president to be a active member and called the father. Like he loved stars, y'all. Literally, he was the first president to be part of a poem. He did a lot of firsts. He was the first president to personally own a reading lamp. Um, and he definitely took on the debts. That was pretty cool. He was the first president to have a presidential cane. He was the first president. No, he was the only president to be publicly. He was the first president to have a cabinet in a foreign. Nice. And he was the first. He was the only. He's the only president you can actually visit his house, which is pretty cool. He was the first president to formally have a state funeral. Nice, and he is called the father of archery. I don't know if you can't really click on the citations, but here are my citations. I hope you enjoyed the video. He's more interesting than people give him.